This clip is going to study the nephron. We're going to look at the anatomy of the nephron, but of course first, let's understand what that is and where that is found. So if you remember our clip about kidney anatomy, we were looking at a cross-sectional view and we were labeling the different components. We also learned that the kidney is going to filter blood and produce urine. So how does it do that? Well, it does that using its smallest functional unit that we call the nephron. And so the kidney is actually full of tube-like structures in the cortex, right at the junction between the renal cortex and the renal medulla. And so each kidney has around 1 to 2 million nephrons. So each kidney has 1 to 2 million nephrons. And so this nephron is the smallest functional unit of the kidney. And so what it does, we're going to look at two components or two compartments of this nephron, and we're going to learn that it's going to filter blood. And so when it filters blood, this filtered material and substance is now known as the filtrate. And then the next step is to convert this filtrate into urine. All right, so these are the functions of the nephron. So we're going to explore the different anatomical parts of the nephron in order to learn then how it can do those two functions and produce your urine. So before we start, let's also trace this red structure, because from the previous clip, you probably also noticed that there was a renal artery coming in to the kidney. And so this renal artery is actually going to then branch into smaller and smaller and smaller branches, all the way until it ends up being very small. And this little vessel is what we call the afferent arteriole. And so this afferent arteriole is going to bring blood to be filtered into the nephron. Okay? And so as this blood comes in through the afferent arteriole, you will then have what we call capillary network. And so this capillary network is called the glomerulus. And so this glomerulus is pretty much what brings in the blood in order to be filtered. After being filtered, blood is then going to leave the nephron through the efferent arteriole. Okay? And so this right here at the glomerulus, this is the site of filtration. And what that means is that there are different forces acting on this blood here in order to push wastes and other substances out of the glomerulus. And so this is the first step in urine formation. And so the next step is, well, where does that filtrate end up? And so the second region of the nephron that we're going to be looking at is a funnel-like structure. And so this funnel-like structure, we call it the glomerular capsule. And its job is to receive this filtrate that has been forced out of the blood vessels. And so this is where filtrate is going to start to accumulate, and now it's going to make its way through a set of tubes. So far, what we've covered is that the nephron is made up of two regions, the glomerulus and the glomerular capsule. Collectively, we call this the renal corpuscle. All right, so the renal corpuscle is made up of one, the glomerulus, which brings in the blood into the nephron to be filtered, and two, the glomerular capsule, also known as the Bowman's capsule, which is going to receive and collect the filtrate. Okay, so next up, let's go ahead and trace the pathway of the filtrate as it's going to head through the nephron. Okay, so the next thing you're going to notice is that there are a series of very, very convoluted tubes. And so this right here, we call it the proximal convoluted tubule. Proximal because it's close to the glomerular capsule. And it's convoluted, very, very squiggly in shape. And so filtrate is going to pass through this proximal convoluted tubule, also known as PCT. Now, after the proximal convoluted tubule, filtrate is then going to go through a very long loop that has a descending limb followed by an ascending limb. So this right here, I'm going to trace the pathway. So next component or compartment of the nephron is the descending limb followed by the ascending limb. And both of those limbs are part of what we call the loop of Henle. Next up, we have yet again another set of convoluted tubules, but this time it's farther away from the Bowman's capsule, so we no longer call it proximal. Instead, we call it distal. So the distal convoluted tubule, also known as DCT. All right, so now we're just tracing the flow of this filtrate down the nephron. And then finally, the last compartment of this nephron is yet again another tube that we call the collecting duct. Okay? And actually the collecting duct has several other branches where other distal convoluted tubules from other nephrons are going to also pool in. And so what they're pooling in at this time is urine. And so all of the filtrate, which is now converted into urine, is now going to head all the way to be funneled and collected by the minor calyx. And if you remember from our previous clip, minor calyx is then going to pool into the major calyx, which will then pool into the renal pelvis, followed by the ureter on its way to the bladder. Right? And so these are the different regions of the nephron. And so in green, I've labeled what we collectively call as the renal tubule. Okay? So the renal tubule is made up of the PCT, loop of Henle, DCT, collecting duct. So these are the two main compartments of the nephron, the renal corpuscle, made up of the glomerulus and the glomerular capsule, and the renal tubule, made up of the PCT, loop of Henle, DCT, and the collecting duct. And so this is the anatomy of the nephron, which is now going to produce urine and then convert the filtrate that was produced by the renal corpuscle into the urine, which will then pool out of the kidney and into the ureter.